Kayla stood under the lights, and for one more second, everything was perfect. The room was full investors, press, buyers from 3 luxury retailers who had fought to get on the guest list. Behind her, the screen glowed with the name she had built with her own hands. 2 years of work, condensed into 90 seconds of video, and a room full of people finally saying yes. Then the screen changed, not a glitch, not a technical error. A document, full screen, time-stamped, with her name on it. Someone in the 3rd row stood up first. Then another, a woman near the front, said it loud enough for the room to hear. "She lied to us." Kayla's mouth went dry. She hadn't lied to anyone. She didn't even recognize the document on the screen behind her. But recognition didn't matter anymore, belief did, and belief was leaving the room in a line of expensive suits and raised phones. Her own phone buzzed in her hand. She hadn't meant to look, but she did. "Unknown number, you should have stayed away from him." Kayla's fingers tightened around the phone. She looked up, past the fleeing investors, past the assistant frozen by the exit, and found him at the back of the room. Si-woo wasn't watching the chaos. He was watching one man near the door, still and expressionless, in a way that made the rest of the room feel like whether he wasn't standing in. He already knew. Kayla crossed the floor before she decided to move. She got close enough to grab his arm, low enough that only he could hear her. "Protect me." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not softness, the opposite. "I'm not protecting you anymore." His voice was quiet, and that was worse than if he'd shouted. "I'm protecting the only person they've ever been stupid enough to threaten." Kayla opened her mouth to answer him. She never got the chance. If you're new here, this is where it starts to get good. Hit subscribe so you don't miss how they got here. Drop a like if you're already invested, and comment where you think this story is headed. 2 months earlier, Kayla Richardson didn't know his name. She knew Seoul the way a person knows a city they've only seen from airport windows and hotel lobbies. Beautiful, unfamiliar, and completely indifferent to whether she succeeded or failed in it. She'd flown in with 4 suitcases, a laptop full of formulas she'd spent 2 years perfecting, and a promise to herself that she wasn't allowed to break. This time, whatever she built would have only her name on it, nobody else's. Not investors who wanted their fingerprints on every decision. Not a man back home who used to smile and call her ambition cute, right before he explained why it wasn't practical. Nobody. Her studio was 2 floors above a tea shop in a quiet part of the city, small enough that she could still smell the raw materials from the hallway, bergamot, sandalwood, something floral she hadn't named yet. It didn't look like much. It looked like hers. The hotel where she was staying, for one more week until her lease started, looked like nothing she'd ever paid for herself. She noticed the security first. Too many men in dark suits for a Tuesday evening, positioned with the kind of stillness that wasn't casual. She noticed him second. He was standing near the elevators, talking to no one, and somehow the entire lobby seemed to organize itself around where he was standing, like furniture arranged around a fireplace nobody wanted to get too close to. Kayla wasn't looking where she was going. She was reading a message from her formulation chemist about a shipment delay, and she walked directly into the small orbit of space that apparently nobody else in the building dared enter. She looked up first at a chest that did not belong to a man who worked behind a desk, then at a face that had clearly perfected the art of making people regret existing near him. 4 men in suits shifted toward her before she'd even finished apologizing. Kayla looked at them, then back at him. "Are you always followed by this many people?" she said. "Or should I be worried I walked into something?" Silence, not the kind of silence that meant no one had heard her. The kind that meant no one could quite believe what they'd heard. The man didn't answer right away. He studied her the way someone studies a language they don't speak, trying to work out if the words meant what they seemed to mean. "You should be worried," he said finally, "about walking into people without looking." Julie noted. Kayla stepped around him. "You should try smiling sometime, might scare people less." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't look back to see his face. If she had, she would have seen something that hadn't happened in the lobby of that hotel in longer than anyone on his security team could remember. Baek Si-woo watched her walk away. And for the first time in years, he wanted to know a name. 2 hours later, Si-woo learned it anyway, not because he asked directly. He never asked directly. He simply mentioned to the head of hotel security, in the tone of a man commenting on the weather, that he was curious who had booked the room adjacent to the East Conference suite. By the time his car pulled away from the hotel, he knew her name. Kayla Richardson, American, here to launch a beauty and fragrance company, traveling alone. He filed it away the way he filed away everything, carefully and with no intention of using it. That had always been the rule. Si-woo had built his entire life around one lesson, learned the hard way, at an age when he was too young to understand that some lessons cost more than they teach. He'd watched people he trusted choose each other over his family, watched loyalty dissolve the moment love gave someone a reason to betray it. He'd watched what was left afterward, the damage, the years it took to rebuild what one weak moment had cost. Since then, he had made himself very hard to reach. Women had tried. Ambitious ones, beautiful ones, dangerous ones who thought they could outmaneuver him. He'd watched all of them with the same detached curiosity he might give a business proposal that wasn't worth his time. He told himself Kayla Richardson would be no different. He was wrong within the week. Kayla saw him again on Thursday in a coffee shop 3 blocks from her studio and told herself it was coincidence. She saw him again on Saturday at a gallery opening she'd been invited to by a contact from the trade office and told herself Seoul was smaller than she'd expected. By the third time, a restaurant, a private room she hadn't known was private until she was already seated at the table beside it. She stopped pretending she believed in coincidence. "You following me?" she asked, when he was close enough to hear. Si-woo looked at her like the question amused him more than it should have. "I own this restaurant. That's not a no." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Kayla studied him for a moment. He wasn't smiling. She got the impression he rarely did, but there was something in the set of his mouth that hadn't been there in the hotel lobby. Less guarded, or maybe just less annoyed. "What is it you actually do?" she asked. "Everyone gets very quiet when your name comes up, and not the good kind of quiet." "I run several businesses." That's the kind of answer people give when they don't want to answer the question. Something flickered across his face, not offense, closer to respect. "Very direct," he said. "I'm very tired of men who think vague is the same as interesting." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before he controlled it back into stillness. "Have dinner with me," he said. "Not here, somewhere I don't own." Kayla considered him for a long moment, the expensive stillness of him, the way the entire restaurant staff moved like they were afraid of drawing his attention. "When was the last time someone told you no?" she asked. "I don't remember." "Good," she said. "Then this will be a new experience for you." She picked up her bag and left him standing there, and for the second time in a week, Baek Si-woo watched a woman walk away from him without looking back, and found himself, against every instinct he'd spent 15 years building, wanting to know what it would take to make her stay. She said yes eventually, not because he asked again, he didn't. 3 days later, Kayla found herself standing outside her own studio at 9 in the evening, staring at a delivery she hadn't ordered, a small crate of raw sandalwood, the kind she'd been trying to source for 2 weeks without luck, with a note that said, "Only I heard you were looking for this." No name. He hadn't needed to sign it. She stood there a long moment, turning the note over like there might be more to it. There wasn't. Just 8 words and a shipment worth more than she wanted to think about. She called the number he'd given her at the restaurant before she could talk herself out of it. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." A pause. "Did it work?" "That depends what you're trying to accomplish." "Dinner," Si-woo said. "Somewhere I don't own." Kayla looked at the crate of sandalwood sitting in her hallway, then at her own reflection in the studio window, tired and still wearing yesterday's blazer because she hadn't gone home in 2 days. "One dinner," she said, "and if you spend the whole time being vague and terrifying, I'm leaving before dessert." "Understood." He picked a place she'd never have found on her own, a restaurant with no sign, tucked behind a bookstore, the kind of place that existed for people who'd rather not be seen. Kayla noted that too, filed it next to everything else she was quietly collecting about him. He asked what she did. She told him. All of it, the 2 years of formulation work, the investors who'd wanted 40% for the privilege of believing in her, the moment she'd walked out of that meeting and decided she'd rather fail on her own terms than succeed on someone else's. Si-woo listened in a way she wasn't used to men listening. He didn't wait for his turn to talk. He didn't redirect the conversation back to himself. "What do you do?" she asked when she realized she'd been talking for 20 minutes and knew nothing more about him than she had at the start. "Investments," he said. "Real estate, a few other things." "Terrible at pretending to be normal," Kayla said. "You know that." His mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close enough that she counted it as a victory. "Most people don't ask twice," he said. "I'm not most people," he said, quiet. "You're not." There was a silence after that, the kind that should have felt awkward and instead felt like something settling into place. Kayla studied him across the table, the stillness that never quite left his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked the room even when he was looking at her, a man who clearly hadn't relaxed in a room in years. "When was the last time someone asked if you were okay?" she asked. "Not your health, not your business." Si-woo went quiet in a different way. Not guarded searching, like the question had reached somewhere he didn't let people reach. He didn't answer, Kayla didn't push. She just watched him not answer and understood that the silence was the answer, and something in her chest softened toward him in a way she hadn't given herself permission for. His security noticed before he did. It started small. Si-woo cancelling a Tuesday meeting because it conflicted with nothing in particular, except that Kayla had mentioned, weeks ago, in passing, that Tuesdays were when her chemist ran new samples, and he found himself wanting to be somewhere he might casually appear. He remembered she took her coffee black, no sugar, and had once complained that Seoul's cafes oversweetened everything by American standards. He remembered the name of her chemist. He remembered she hated being interrupted mid-sentence and that she'd once gone quiet for the rest of a dinner after a waiter did exactly that. He hadn't tried to remember any of it. It had simply stayed. "Should we start calling her the boss?" one of his men said, half-joking. After the third time, Si-woo rerouted his schedule around her studio's neighborhood. Si-woo gave him a look that ended the joke permanently, but that night alone, he found himself replaying it, not with anger. With something closer to unease, the recognition that he was becoming predictable, in a life where predictability got people killed. He found Kayla 3 days later at the studio, later than he should have been anywhere, and she looked up from a work table covered in glass vials to find him standing in her doorway looking, for the first time since she'd met him, exhausted. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you. Down before you fall down," he sat. She didn't ask why he'd come, and he didn't offer an explanation, and for a while they just existed in the small, cluttered quiet of her studio, her hands moving between vials, his eyes tracking her without any of the calculation he usually gave everything he looked at. "Why do you never relax?" she asked eventually, not looking up. "People who relax around me usually end up regretting it." Kayla set down the vial in her hand, looked at him properly. "Maybe you're just used to people being afraid of you," she said. "That's not the same thing as danger." She went back to her work. She didn't wait for him to respond. Si-woo sat in the quiet of her studio, surrounded by the smell of bergamot and something floral he still hadn't asked the name of, and understood, with a discomfort that felt almost like fear, that Kayla Richardson had just seen something in him that he'd spent 15 years making sure no one could find. He didn't come back the next day, or the day after that. Kayla told herself she didn't notice, and then caught herself checking her phone 3 times in an hour for a message that wasn't coming, and stopped lying to herself about it. She didn't call him. That wasn't who she was, and she wasn't about to become someone new for a man who couldn't decide if he wanted to be found. Instead, she went back to work. Investor meetings. A packaging supplier who kept missing deadlines. A trade show in 2 months that her entire launch depended on. She let her studio fill back up with the only thing she'd ever fully trusted, her own hands, building something that couldn't walk away from her because she hadn't given it the chance. Si-woo, meanwhile, was breaking every rule he'd built his life around, just in the opposite direction. He buried himself in work that didn't need his attention. He sat through meetings without hearing a word of them. He caught himself twice, driving toward her neighborhood before he'd consciously decided to go anywhere, and turning around both times with a frustration that had nowhere else to go. His assistant mentioned, carefully, that a business contact had seen Kayla at a dinner with another man, an investor, apparently, from one of the retail groups courting her brand. Si-woo said nothing. He didn't ask which restaurant. He didn't need to know. He went anyway. He told himself it was unrelated, a property he'd been meaning to look at, 2 blocks from where his assistant had mentioned the dinner was happening, at exactly the hour it would be happening. He stood across the street like a man who had never in his life needed to justify where he stood, and watched through the window as Kayla laughed at something the other man said. It wasn't the laugh of a woman falling for someone. Si-woo could tell the difference. He'd watched enough rooms, enough faces, to know performance from feeling. This was performance. Professional charm, deployed the way she probably deployed it in every meeting that mattered to her business. It didn't matter. His hands were in fists inside his coat pockets regardless. He left before she could see him standing there like a man who had no reason to be. Kayla noticed him 3 days later, in the coffee shop again, watching her from a table across the room in a way that wasn't subtle no matter how still he tried to hold himself. She walked over, sat down without being invited. "Is there something you want to say?" No, then stop looking at me like you're planning someone's funeral. Si-woo's jaw tightened. I heard you had dinner with someone. I had dinner with an investor, Kayla said, who is currently deciding whether to put money into my company. Is that a problem for you? No, you're a terrible liar for someone so intimidating. He didn't answer that. Kayla watched him not answer it, the same way she'd watched him not answer her question in the restaurant weeks ago, and something in her chest, which she'd been carefully protecting since the day she landed in Seoul, ached in a way she didn't have room for. You disappeared, she said, quieter now. No calls, no messages, and now you're sitting in my coffee shop watching me like I did something wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. Then what is this? Si-woo looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Kayla almost regretted asking, almost braced herself for another silence he'd let stretch out until it answered for him. I don't know how to do this, he said finally. Do what? His eyes held hers. Whatever this is, I've never let it get this far before. Kayla's chest tightened. She kept her voice level anyway. That's not an answer, Si-woo. That's an excuse with better packaging. She stood, gathered her bag, and this time she did look back, just once at the door, and found him still sitting there, watching her leave, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It looked almost like fear. And driving away from that coffee shop with nothing solved and nothing said clearly enough to matter, Si-woo finally let himself admit, in the privacy of his own car, what he'd been refusing to say out loud for weeks. He wasn't just intrigued by her, he was in love with her. And for a man who had spent his entire adult life believing love was the one thing that could destroy everything he'd built, that realization felt less like falling and more like standing at the edge of something with no idea how far down it went. It happened on a Tuesday. Kayla was locking up the studio, later than she meant to be, her mind already 3 steps ahead on packaging revisions, when she noticed the man across the street. He wasn't doing anything unusual, leaning against a wall, checking his phone, except that she'd seen him twice already that week, in places too far apart to be coincidence. She told herself she was being paranoid. She locked the door anyway, checked it twice, and walked the long way to the main road instead of the shortcut through the alley she usually took. The man followed her for exactly 1 block before he spoke. Miss Richardson, not a question. He already knew who she was. You've been spending a lot of time with someone you shouldn't. Kayla's pulse spiked, but her voice came out steadier than she felt. I'm sorry, do I know you? No, he smiled, and it didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. But you know him, and people who know him tend to become complicated for everyone around them. He didn't touch her, he didn't need to. He let the silence do the threatening, and then he turned and walked away like he'd simply been passing through, leaving Kayla standing on a street corner with her heart slamming against her ribs and absolutely no doubt about what she'd just been told. She called Si-woo before she decided to. He arrived in under 10 minutes, and the moment he stepped out of the car, Kayla understood, really understood, for the first time, what people meant when they said he was dangerous. It wasn't in anything he did. It was in the total absence of anything soft in his face. Tell me exactly what he said, Si-woo said. Not a request, she told him, watched his jaw tighten with every word. Putting security on you, he said, already reaching for his phone. Someone at the studio around the clock. You'll move to? No, he looked at her like the word didn't compute. Kayla, no. She stepped back from him, putting space between them she hadn't needed until this exact moment. You don't get to decide where I live because you're scared. This isn't about being scared. This is about keeping you safe, controlling everywhere I go, everyone I see. Her voice cracked just slightly and she hated it. I don't need you deciding what happens to my life. Si-woo went very still. I'm trying to protect you. Then why do you keep acting like I'm yours to protect? The words came out sharper than she meant them, but she didn't take them back. Like I'm something that belongs to you now instead of a person who happened to fall. She stopped herself, silence. The kind that had weight to it. Si-woo said, quiet. Kayla's throat tightened. Why do you keep pulling me close and then disappearing? What is it you actually want from me? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had none of its usual control in it. Because I don't know what to do with how I feel about you. He looked at her like the admission cost him something physical. I've spent my entire life making sure nobody could become important enough to hurt me. I built an empire around that one rule. And then, he stopped. Then you happened. Kayla finished, softer now. Then I happened. His jaw worked. And I don't know how to want someone without needing to control every single thing that could take them from me. That's the only kind of protecting I know how to do. Kayla studied him for a long moment, this man who just handed her the most honest thing he'd probably said out loud in 15 years, standing in front of her like he expected her to walk away from it. Then learn a different kind, she said. If you love me, don't turn me into something you own. Something shifted in his face, not surrender, exactly. Closer to understanding, arriving somewhere it had never been allowed before. I don't know how, he admitted. Then we'll figure it out. Kayla stepped closer, close enough now that she could see the exact moment his breath changed. Together, not you deciding for both of us. He looked at her like he was asking permission for something he'd never had to ask permission for in his life. Kayla closed the distance herself. The kiss wasn't rushed, and it wasn't the kind of thing either of them had planned. It was quiet and a little uncertain on his end in a way that surprised her, the most feared man in Seoul, kissing her like he was afraid of getting it wrong. When they broke apart, Si-woo rested his forehead against hers, breathing like something in his chest had finally loosened after 15 years of holding it tight. I still want to put security on your studio, he murmured. Kayla almost laughed. One thing at a time, Si-woo. If you're still with them at this point, this is exactly where I need you. Like this, if you want to see how deep this goes, subscribe for the next chapter and comment who you're rooting harder for right now. Something shifted after that night. Si-woo didn't become a different man. Kayla wouldn't have wanted that, wouldn't have trusted it if he had. But the edges of him softened when it was just the two of them, in ways his security team clocked and never mentioned out loud. He learned how she took her coffee without being told twice. He started showing up at the studio not to check on her, but simply because he wanted to be somewhere she was, sitting quietly in the corner with paperwork he barely looked at while she worked through formulations late into the night. Kayla found him one evening asleep in the chair by her work table, head tipped back, looking younger than she'd ever seen him, none of the careful control he wore like armor everywhere else. She stood there a long moment just watching him breathe, and something in her chest settled into a warmth she hadn't let herself feel in longer than she wanted to admit. He woke to find her watching him. How long was I out? Long enough that I got 3 new formulas done in peace, she said. You're surprisingly good company when you're unconscious. Take that as a compliment. Don't, it wasn't one. But she was smiling when she said it, and Si-woo, the man half of Seoul, crossed the street to avoid, reached over, and tucked a loose braid behind her ear like it was the most natural thing in the world. He took her somewhere no one knew him. A small restaurant outside the city, run by a woman who called him by a nickname Kayla had never heard anyone use, in a dialect that made his shoulders drop in a way she'd never seen. He didn't explain who the woman was. Kayla didn't ask. She understood, watching him laugh, actually laugh, low and a little rusty from disuse, that he was showing her a version of himself that existed before all the rest of it. Different here, she said. I used to come here as a kid, he admitted. Before everything hung in the air between them, heavier than the sentence should have carried. Kayla didn't push. She'd learned over 2 months that Si-woo gave things when he was ready, not when he was asked. She told him about her mother instead, the woman who'd raised her on the belief that a black woman's ambition would always be called too much by somebody, and that the only cure was building something so undeniable nobody could argue with it. She told him about the relationship she'd left behind in the States, the man who'd smiled while he explained why her dreams weren't practical, and how she'd promised herself, packing those 4 suitcases, that she'd never again build anything with someone else's fingerprints on it. If I ever offer to fix something for you, Si-woo said slowly, with money, with connections, tell me to stop. Kayla looked at him, surprised. Why? Because I think you'd let it happen once to keep the peace. And I think it would cost you something you'd never get back. She hadn't expected him to understand that without being told twice. It made something in her chest ache in the good way, the way that scared her more than his reputation ever had. The trouble started small enough that neither of them thought much of it at first. An investor Kayla had been courting for months suddenly went quiet, no explanation given. A supplier cancelled a contract with no warning, citing reasons that didn't add up when she checked them against the paperwork. A journalist reached out asking oddly specific questions about her personal life, who she was seeing, whether it was true her boyfriend was connected. Kayla brought it to Si-woo, more irritated than alarmed. Someone's asking questions about us. His face went very still, the way it did right before he made a decision he didn't want to explain. Specific enough that it wasn't a guess. She stuttered him, you know something. I have a guess, he didn't elaborate. I want you to let me handle it. Handle it how? The way I handle things. Kayla felt the old tension return, the one she thought they'd already worked through weeks ago in that alley. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. He reached for her hand, and for a moment his grip was tighter than usual, not controlling, she realized, afraid. "Kayla, I need you to trust me on this." "Do trust you," she said. That's not the same as agreeing to be managed. He didn't answer that. And the silence, this time, didn't feel like understanding. It felt like the first quiet warning of a fight neither of them was ready to have. The launch was 6 weeks out when the real threats started. Not vague warnings anymore. A break-in at her supplier's warehouse, nothing stolen, nothing damaged, just proof that someone could get in. A car that sat outside her studio for 3 nights straight, empty, driven off before anyone could get close enough to see who'd left it. Then, worst of all, a photograph slipped under her studio door, Kayla and Si-woo, taken from across the street, at the restaurant outside the city he'd never taken anyone else to. No note. It didn't need one. Si-woo showed up within the hour, and this time there was nothing careful about the way he moved through her studio, checking the windows, the door, the alley behind the building like a man counting exits. "That's it," he said. "You're not staying here, Si-woo. I'm putting a team on this building around the clock, and you're moving somewhere I control the access to." Today, Kayla felt something in her chest go cold, and not from fear of whoever had left the photograph. "Say that back to yourself." "Kayla, someone is threatening you because of me. I'm not debating this. You're not debating it because you've already decided." Her voice rose despite herself. "You said you loved me. You said you didn't want to own me. And the first time things get hard, you're back to deciding where I sleep and who gets to see me, trying to keep you alive, turning me into a prisoner." She was shaking now, and she hated that she was shaking, hated that fear and fury were tangled up together, and she couldn't separate them fast enough to sound as steady as she wanted to. "If loving me means turning me into something you lock away every time it gets dangerous, then you haven't learned anything, Si-woo. You've just gotten better at hiding it." His jaw worked. For a moment she thought he might actually shout. She'd never seen it, not once, but something in his face looked close to the edge of it. Instead his voice went very quiet. Worse than shouting, "I don't know how to lose someone and survive it a second time." Kayla's anger cracked just slightly at the rawness in that, but she didn't back down. "Then trust me to help you keep both of us safe. Don't just decide for me. This isn't a business negotiation," she said. "It's my life. And you don't get to run it like one of your operations just because you're frightened." Si-woo said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that Kayla picked up her bag, hands still unsteady, and walked past him toward the door. "I need space," she said, not looking back. "From this, from you making decisions I never agreed to." She left him standing alone in her studio, surrounded by the smell of bergamot and sandalwood, and for the second time in 2 months, Si-woo watched her walk away. Except this time, he understood exactly what he'd done to cause it. He didn't chase her. It was the hardest thing he'd done in 15 years, harder than any negotiation, any threat, any war he'd fought to protect what was his, but he let her go, because some small, buried part of him understood that chasing her now would only prove her right. Instead, he sat with it, the fear. The old, familiar instinct to control every variable until nothing could touch what mattered to him, an instinct that had kept his empire standing for a decade and had just cost him the one thing his empire had never been able to give him. His inner circle noticed the change in him before he said a word about it. Especially the man who'd known him longest, who'd helped raise him after everything fell apart all those years ago, who'd taught him, patiently and with love, that the world only respected what you controlled. "She's making you weak," the older man said quietly, the night Si-woo sat alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home. "I warned you this would happen." Si-woo looked up. "You don't know anything about it. I know you haven't slept in days. I know you're distracted in every meeting that matters. I know the men who used to fear you are starting to wonder if you've gone soft." The older man's voice was gentle, almost fatherly, which made it worse. "Love did this to your family once already. I watched it happen. I promised myself I'd never let it happen to you. This is different." "It's never different," the man said. "It just feels different right up until it isn't." Si-woo didn't answer. He didn't have the energy to argue with the one voice that had shaped nearly everything he believed about love, loyalty, and weakness. The voice that had raised him out of the wreckage of the first betrayal and told him, over and over, that this was how he'd survive. He didn't yet know that the same voice was already speaking to someone else entirely, someone circling Kayla's business, waiting for the exact right moment to make his weakness cost him everything. Kayla didn't go home. She went back to work, because work was the one thing that had never once betrayed her, and because sitting still with her feelings about Si-woo felt like a luxury she couldn't afford 6 weeks before the biggest night of her career. But she couldn't shake the wrongness of it all. The cancelled contracts, the investor who'd gone silent, the break-in that took nothing. None of it added up to random bad luck, and Kayla had built an entire company on the belief that patterns meant something. She started pulling records instead of waiting for someone to explain them to her. The supplier who'd cancelled her contract had done it 2 days after a payment came through from an account she didn't recognize. The investor who'd gone quiet had, according to a contact of hers in the trade office, taken a meeting the same week with someone connected to a rival syndicate, a name she'd heard once, in passing, from Si-woo, in a tone that told her not to ask more. Kayla stared at the pattern on her laptop screen until it stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like a campaign. Someone wasn't just threatening her because of Si-woo. Someone was trying to destroy her business specifically, methodically, in a way that would hurt him without ever touching him directly. She thought about calling Si-woo. She thought about it for a long time. Instead, she called her lawyer and then her accountant and spent the next 3 days building a timeline of every cancelled deal, every strange payment, every place the pattern intersected with a name she recognized from things Si-woo had let slip without meaning to. When she finally went to him, she didn't go asking for protection. She went with a folder. Si-woo opened the door to find her standing there, chin up, folder in hand, looking like a woman who had spent 3 sleepless nights proving a point rather than waiting for one to be made for her. "I'm still angry at you," she said before he could speak. "That hasn't changed, but I found something and you need to see it." He stepped back to let her in. She didn't wait for an invitation to sit. She spread the folder across his desk, pages of financial records and dates lined up like evidence in a trial she'd built by herself. "Every supplier who's dropped me, every investor who's gone cold. It's not random," she said. "There's a payment trail. It leads back to an account connected to the people you've been trying to keep me from asking about." Si-woo went very still, scanning the pages. His jaw tightened as he reached a name circled twice near the bottom of the 3rd page. "Where did you get this account?" "Contact at the trade office." "Why?" He didn't answer right away. When he looked up at her, something in his face had gone cold in a way she hadn't seen directed at her before, not at her, through her at something else entirely. "This account," he said slowly, "has only ever been used by one person to move money without leaving a trace back to him." "Who?" Si-woo's throat worked. When he said the name, it wasn't the rival families. It was the man who'd raised him. Kayla watched something break behind his eyes, not anger, not yet. Something closer to the floor giving out beneath a lifetime of certainty. "He's the one who taught me love makes you weak," Si-woo said quietly. "He's been telling me that for 15 years, and he's been the one feeding them everything." Kayla reached for his hand. This time he let her. "I wanted to protect you by controlling everything around you," he said. "The whole time, the person I trusted most was the one thing I never controlled at all." "Then let's fix that," Kayla said. "Together, not you deciding alone and not me finding out after the fact. Together." Si-woo looked at her, really looked at her, the folder between them, the proof she'd built with her own hands because she'd refused to sit and wait to be saved, and understood, with a clarity that had taken him 35 years and one impossible woman to arrive at, exactly what trust was supposed to feel like. Together, he agreed. The launch was 17 days away. Neither of them yet knew it would be the night everything finally came to a head. The 17 days that followed moved differently than any Si-woo had lived through before. He didn't confront the man who'd raised him. Not yet. Kayla had convinced him of that, in a conversation that started as an argument and ended somewhere closer to a plan. If they moved too soon, the mole would simply vanish, and the rival family would find another way in. Better to let him believe he was still invisible. Better to watch and wait and let him make one more mistake. It cost Si-woo more than Kayla understood, sitting across from a man who'd taught him everything he knew about loyalty and pretending not to know he'd spent 15 years lying to him. But he did it. For her. For the version of himself she'd convinced him he could still become. Kayla, meanwhile, refused to slow down. Her team thought she was reckless, pushing forward with the launch despite everything. Her lawyer suggested delaying. Si-woo more than once suggested the same, in the careful tone of a man trying very hard not to sound like he was giving an order. "If I delay," Kayla told him, standing in her studio surrounded by sample bottles and packaging mock-ups, "they win, not just the launch. They win the part of this that was always about making me disappear. I know, I'm not delaying. She looked at him steadily. I need you to trust that. Do. He said it without hesitation this time, and Kayla heard the difference, heard a man who'd spent 2 months relearning a language he'd never let himself speak. I trust you, I just want to be in the room when it happens. Then be in the room, she said. Not in front of me, beside me. He nodded once, and something settled between them, not the giddy weightlessness of the early weeks, but something sturdier. Chosen this time on purpose, by 2 people who'd both had to unlearn something to get there. 3 nights before the launch, Si-woo's security picked up movement around the warehouse holding her launch inventory, the same warehouse that had been broken into weeks earlier. Nothing taken, just proof again that someone could get close. Si-woo wanted a full team on it immediately. Kayla asked him to wait 1 more day. If we move now, they'll know we're onto them, she said. Let them think the warehouse worked. Let them show their hands somewhere bigger. Somewhere bigger turned out to be the launch itself. Kayla had suspected it for days. The sabotage had always been building towards something with an audience, something designed to humiliate her as publicly and permanently as possible. A cancelled contract could be quietly fixed. A doctored document, broadcast in front of every investor and journalist she'd spent 2 years courting, could not. She spent the 2 nights before launch going through her own presentation files line by line, checking every document against a backup she kept nowhere near her main servers, tracing every possible point where someone could slip something false into what the room would see. She found the vulnerability the night before the launch, a shared access point in the venue's AV system, the kind installed by a contractor with no idea who'd eventually use it against her. She didn't remove it. Instead, she and Si-woo built a trap around it, one thread of false information they could trace the moment someone reached for it, small enough not to raise suspicion, specific enough that whoever took the bait would be handing over exactly the proof they still needed. If this works, Si-woo said, the night before, watching her finalize the plan with the same precision she brought to every formula in her lab, we'll know who's been feeding him information. Every name. If it doesn't work, then we'll be standing in that room together when it falls apart, he said, which is more than either of us had 2 months ago. Kayla allowed herself, for one unguarded moment, to lean into him, not for protection, not for rescue, just to feel, before the night that would decide everything, what it was like to stand beside someone instead of behind them, or in front of them, or apart from them entirely. More days, she said. More days, he agreed, and neither of them said out loud how much could still go wrong before then. The launch night arrived exactly the way Kayla had spent 2 years imagining it, the room glowing, the product she'd built with her own hands finally under lights, instead of hidden away in a studio only she and her chemist had seen. She stood backstage in the final minutes before walking out, running through the plan one more time. The trap was set. The false document sat exactly where they'd left it, waiting for someone to reach for it. Somewhere in the crowd, Si-woo's people were watching every screen, every laptop, every possible access point. What none of them had accounted for was how fast it would move once it started. Kayla was 3 minutes into her presentation, the room warm, engaged, exactly where she needed it to be when the screen behind her changed. It wasn't the trap. It was worse. Whoever had taken the bait hadn't just accessed the false document, they'd found something else, something real enough to look damning, even though it wasn't true, time-stamped and formatted to look like an internal memo admitting to cutting corners on safety testing. The room reacted exactly as designed to. An investor near the front stood first. A journalist near the back was already typing. Somewhere in the crowd, a voice said it loud enough to carry, "She lied to us." And Kayla felt 2 years of work start to slide out from under her in real time, in front of every person whose belief she'd spent that time earning. She looked toward the back of the room. Si-woo wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at one man near the exit, whose stillness didn't match the panic spreading around him, the same stillness Si-woo himself wore when he already knew exactly what was about to happen. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Unknown number. You should have stayed away from him. Kayla's chest went tight. This was the moment. Everything they'd built toward, arriving exactly where they'd known it would, except now, standing in the middle of it, it didn't feel like a plan. It felt like watching her life get taken apart in front of an audience. She crossed the floor towards Si-woo before she decided to move. "Protect me," she said, low enough that only he could hear, gripping his arm, something hardened in his eyes, not at her, past her toward the man by the door. "Not protecting you anymore." His voice was quiet, controlled, and somehow more dangerous for it. I'm protecting the only person they've ever been stupid enough to threaten. He moved before she could answer, not toward her, toward the exit, toward the man who just realized he'd been made. But Kayla didn't stay behind him. She turned toward the room instead, toward the investors already reaching for their coats, toward the journalist with a phone raised and ready to publish something that wasn't true. She raised her voice, not panicked, not pleading, the same voice that had built a company out of nothing. That document is false, she said, loud enough to cut through the noise. And in the next 60 seconds, I'm going to show you exactly who put it there and why. Room didn't stop moving, but it slowed. Enough for Si-woo to reach the man by the door. Enough for Kayla to reach for the backup files she'd hidden 3 layers deep in a server no one but her chemist knew existed. Enough, finally, for 2 months of falling in love and 2 weeks of building a trap together to become the same thing. 2 people standing in the same fire, refusing to let it take either one of them down alone. Si-woo reached the man by the door before he'd made it 3 steps outside. He didn't need to say anything threatening. His presence alone was enough to stop most people cold, and this man, mid-level, someone Si-woo recognized now as a courier he'd seen twice in his own building without ever suspecting him, went pale the moment he turned around. "Walk back inside," Si-woo said, "or I make sure you never walk anywhere comfortably again." Man walked back inside, behind them. Kayla had already climbed back onto the small stage, laptop open, the room's chaos narrowing into something closer to attention as she pulled up the real files, time-stamped, verified, matched against the doctored version still glowing behind her. "This is the actual safety testing data," she said, voice steady even though her hands weren't quite. "Independently verified, 3 labs, all results attached. What was on that screen a few minutes ago was fabricated and planted through a vulnerability in this venue system that I found myself 48 hours ago." A murmur moved through the room, not belief yet, but doubt about their doubt, which was enough to buy her the next 30 seconds. "I found it," Kayla continued, "because I went looking for exactly this. Someone has spent 6 weeks trying to destroy this launch before it happened, cancelled contracts, break-ins, threats sent directly to my phone. Tonight they made their move in front of all of you, which means tonight they made their first real mistake." She nodded toward the back of the room, where Si-woo now stood with the courier, 2 of his men flanking the exits so no one else could slip out unnoticed. "That man," Kayla said, "was paid to access this system tonight. I have the access logs. I have the account the payment came from, and in about 10 minutes, once my legal team pulls the rest, I'll have the name of exactly who's behind it." Room had gone properly quiet now, the kind of quiet that meant people were recalculating fast whether they'd been about to abandon something real. The investor who'd stood first sat back down. It took less than the 10 minutes Kayla had promised. The courier, faced with Si-woo's silence and the weight of consequences he clearly understood better than anyone in the room, gave up the name without much resistance. Not the rival family directly, a name higher up their chain, someone who'd been paying him for information about Si-woo's schedule, his security patterns, and the account that had funded the whole operation, cross-referenced against the folder Kayla had built weeks earlier, matched exactly what she and Si-woo already knew. Si-woo's phone rang 30 minutes later, not a call he was expecting, a voice he'd known his entire life. "You should have listened to me," the older man said, without preamble, without denial. There was no point denying it anymore. Si-woo could hear it in the careful stillness of his voice, a man who'd already accepted he'd been caught. "I told you love would make you weak. I told you it would cost you everything you built." "It didn't cost me anything," Si-woo said. "You tried to make sure it would. That's different." Silence on the line. "I did it to protect you," the man said finally. "Everything I taught you, everything I built with you, I watched what love did to your family once. I wasn't going to watch it happen again." "You didn't protect me," Si-woo said, quiet, final. "You just made sure I'd never trust anyone enough to find out you were wrong." He ended the call before the man could answer. Whatever came next, and something would, consequences that belonged to a world Kayla had never fully seen and never would need to, wasn't a conversation. It was a decision Si-woo had already made the moment he'd chosen, in front of a room full of people, to stand beside her instead of in front of her. He found Kayla back on the small stage, alone now, watching the last of the investors filter back in, drawn by curiosity or relief, or the simple fact that a scandal survived in real time made for a better story than a scandal that succeeded. "It's done," he said, The name matches. Everything you found, it's all confirmed. Kayla exhaled, the adrenaline finally starting to leave her shoulders. So we won. You won, Si-woo said. I just made sure the door stayed shut while you did it. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who 2 months ago hadn't known how to want someone without needing to control them, standing in front of her now, having done exactly the opposite, having trusted her enough to let her fight for her own company in front of the very people whose belief she needed most. Together, she reminded him. Together, he agreed, and for the first time all night, something in his face looked less like a man managing a crisis and more like a man who just watched the woman he loved become exactly who she'd always said she'd become, with nobody's name on it but her own. The launch, in the end, didn't fail. It became something better than the evening Kayla had originally planned. A story investors and journalists would tell for months, about the founder who caught sabotage in real time and turned a room's doubt into proof of exactly how much control she had over her own company. 3 new investors signed by the end of the week. The retailer who'd been on the fence before the chaos called her personally to move up their meeting. But that wasn't the part Kayla found herself thinking about most in the quiet days after. It was the 6 weeks before it. The folder she'd built alone at first, out of stubbornness and fear and a refusal to be managed. The moment Si-woo had let her walk into that room without trying to remove her from the danger himself. The way he'd stood at the back of it, present and terrifying and entirely hers, without once needing to be the one who fixed it. He took her back to the restaurant outside the city, the one that knew him by a name from before everything, 2 weeks after the launch. The woman who ran it greeted Kayla like she already belonged there, which Kayla realized she probably did by now. Si-woo was quieter than usual through dinner, and Kayla noticed it the way she noticed everything about him now, not with worry, but with the particular attention of someone who'd learned to read his silences instead of fearing them. Doing the thing, she said, where you're about to say something and building up to it like it's a hostile negotiation. Never done this before, he admitted. I don't know the right way to say it. There isn't a right way, there's just the true way. He reached across the table and took her hand, not asking permission this time, simply reaching, the way he'd learned to over 2 months of unlearning everything he thought he knew about wanting someone without owning them. I spent 15 years believing the safest life was one where nobody could reach far enough in to hurt me, he said. I built an empire around it. I let it cost me the one relationship I should have questioned a long time before I did. Kayla stayed quiet, letting him find it in his own time. Then you walked into a hotel lobby and asked if you should be worried, he said, and every rule I'd built my life around stopped making sense one at a time. He reached into his jacket. Kayla's breath caught, but he didn't produce a ring, not yet. He set a small velvet box on the table, closed, and left his hand resting near it instead of opening it himself. I don't want to own your future, he said. I spent 2 months learning the difference between protecting someone and controlling them, and I'm not going to forget it the moment I ask you this. So I'm not going to open this and expect an answer. I'm going to leave it here, and you can open it whenever you decide you want to, tonight, next month, whenever it's actually yours to open. Kayla looked at the box. Then at him, this man who'd learned, slower and harder than anyone she'd ever known, how to want someone without needing to hold them still to keep them. She reached out and opened it herself. The ring inside wasn't showy. It was exactly the kind of thing a woman who'd spent 2 years building something with her own hands would want to wear on it. Simple, deliberate, chosen by someone who'd clearly paid attention to every detail she'd ever mentioned in passing. I don't want to be Mrs. Baek Si-woo, she said quietly, watching his face carefully. Not if it means becoming someone smaller than who I already built myself into. I know, Si-woo said. I'm not asking you to be smaller. I'm asking you to let me be part of what you're already building. That's all I want, to be there when you do it. Kayla felt something in her chest finally settle, not the giddy, uncertain warmth of the early weeks, but something sturdier, chosen deliberately by a woman who'd already proven in front of a room full of people that she never needed rescuing to survive. She lifted the ring from the box herself, slid it on herself. Then build it with me, she said, not for me. With me 6 months later, Kayla's brand had a second location, Tokyo, this time, a market she'd been eyeing since before she ever set foot in Seoul. Her studio still smelled like bergamot and sandalwood, and something floral she'd finally named, months ago after the man who'd learned, the hard way, that loving someone was never about making them safer by making them smaller. Si-woo still terrified most of Seoul. His reputation hadn't softened, and neither had the world he ran, careful and controlled in every place that wasn't Kayla. But in the small studio above the tea shop, in the quiet corner chair he still occupied most evenings while she worked, he was simply a man who'd learned, slowly, imperfectly, entirely because of her, that love had never been the weakness he'd spent his whole life running from. It had been the one thing worth becoming strong enough for. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe so you catch the next one, drop a like if Kayla and Si-woo earned it, and tell me in the comments, was it the folder, the confession, or the launch night that won you over?